All right. Hello again, everyone, and good afternoon. Once more, my name is Justin Chu. I am a program manager here at Prosperity Now, and I'm excited to cover a little bit of welcome and housekeeping. For today's conversation, this webinar is being recorded and will be mailed to registrants and attendees and will be available online within 1 week. So keep an eye on your inbox for the full recording and slides. All webinar attendees are muted to ensure sound quality. We don't want any additional cross noise or anything like that, so you get the most of the conversation, but we still want you to engage. If you want to ask a question or share your thoughts, please type it into the text box of your GoToWebinar control panel. And if you're experiencing any technical issues, please email gotomeeting@prosperitynow.org. So getting the most out of today's call, join from a quiet space. Like I said, grab a coffee or settled in, and engage with us and send in your questions. I'll turn it over quickly to Shanice to get us started. Shanice?
All right. Thank you so much, Justin. So hello, everybody, and welcome again. So as Justin shared, my name is Shanice Van Mero, and I'm the State and Local Policy Manager at Prosperity Now. So we have a great agenda for you today. Next slide, please. All right, so Justin gave us a great welcome and some housekeeping notes, and I'm just going through the overview. So after this brief overview, I will introduce our great panelists for the afternoon, and then I'm going to come back on to moderate the Q&A portion and then close out on this great session. Next slide, please. All right, so for those of you all who are new to Prosperity Now, our mission is to ensure everyone in our country has a clear path to financial stability, wealth, and prosperity. And we do that through many avenues, including our awesome group of networks, programming, and advocating for progressive policies that prioritize uplifting households with low and moderate income. All right, next slide, please. All right, and so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our fantastic speakers for the day. So we have Tiffany Ward. She is a director of the Montgomery County Office of Racial Equity and Social Justice. Jan Marie Pena. She is the Performance Management and Data Analyst at the Montgomery County Office of Legislative Oversight, and Sarah Alvarez, who is the Program Manager and Policy Analyst at the Montgomery County Office of Racial Equity and Social Justice. So I will kick it over to our panelists to give a session overview. Next slide, please.
Hello and good afternoon, everybody. Again, I am Tiffany Ward. I am the Director of the Office of Racial Equity and Social Justice in Montgomery County. This is just an overview of the session. And as Shani said, I'm joined by my two other panelists, Sarah Alvarez and Jan Marie Pena, who will introduce themselves in just a little bit. Just an overview of the day or of our presentation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the creation and the function of our Office of Racial Equity and Social Justice, as well as our Office of Legislative Oversight. Then there's a quick poll for you all, and then we'll talk about our racial equity tools, but in particular our racial equity and racial equity impact assessments, as well as our racial equity and social justice impact statements produced by the Office of Legislative Oversight. We'll talk about data sources, our live case study, and then you guys will get a chance to ask us questions, and hopefully we can have some answers for you that we hope will be satisfactory. Next slide. All right, a little bit about the creation of the actual legislation that created our office and set the charge for the work of implementing racial equity and social justice in Montgomery County. We'll talk a little bit about our community conversations, which is really an opportunity for us to engage our community, and what we wanted the legislation to look like. We'll talk a little bit more then about the act itself and what it requires our office to implement. And then of course, some of the amendments to the act that actually put forth also put in our charge the work of creating racial equity and social justice impact assessments. Next slide. So community conversations. At the inception of really thinking about creating this legislation, our county council actually did a resolution stating that the county would go about a process of trying to figure out how we would create this legislation, what the breadth and depth of the legislation would be, and then really wanting to talk to our community members about what they thought this legislation should look like, right? And one of the tenets of racial equity is really about community engagement. And so we wanted to put that at the forefront, even of creating the legislation. So what we did is we created a series of about 4 conversations around the county. County is broken up into different, what we call sections. So there's up county, down county, east to west county. And so we went to all of our regional services centers and had conversations with community members about what they thought the legislation should look like, what issue areas should be prominent in this legislation, how we should identify, what metrics we should use when we're talking about closing racial disparities and gaps, and then really wanting to gather all of that information and use this as we started to create our the legislation that would create the Office of Racial Equity and Social Justice. Next slide. So our enabling legislation was actually passed in December of 2019. That legislation requires us as the Office of Racial Equity and Social Justice to train all of our employees in the tenets of racial equity and social justice. It also requires that we look at all of our budget decisions with a racial equity lens. Requires that we require that the Office of Legislative Oversight develop racial equity impact statements for all bills that come out of the County Council. And then it required us to also, meaning the Office of Racial Equity and Social Justice, to make sure that all of our budget pieces promote racial equity and social justice. What we'll talk about today is one of the tools that we use to do that. We use many tools actually to go about our work, whether it is budget equity tools, racial equity impact assessments. You guys will hear in depth about racial equity impact statements and impact assessments. Next slide. So Bill 4420, which was actually an amendment to the original bill, is the amendment that required us to actually do a racial equity impact assessment on supplemental appropriations. And for those who are not in the government world, a supplemental appropriation is really a budget ask that happens outside of the traditional budget process. So we pass our budget in May of every year. And if you as a department need additional dollars that are needed for after you have already gone through the budget process, you're required to go through what's called a supplemental process. And so our office is required to give you a racial equity and social justice impact assessment on that particular supplemental appropriation. So it also requires that we, the council, develop a process to do this as well for special appropriations. And that's really supplemental appropriations that come from their side as opposed to the executive side. And the OLO actually does zoning text amendments, racial equity and social justice impact statements for zoning text amendments. That started in September of 2021. As you can see, our bill and our law is comprehensive and really try to give an eye to racial equity in all of our decision making, both legislative, budgetary, and in zoning, trying to make sure that the county is looking through a racial equity lens at all of its major decisions. Next slide. Now we have the poll.
I'm on, here we go. So I'll queue up the poll. My name is Sarah Alvarez. I am a program manager and policy analyst in the Office of Racial Equity and Social Justice. And we wanted to, before we dive in a little bit deeper, wanted to get a better sense of your familiarity with racial equity tools. So you'll see here, you've got several options to indicate the level of familiarity your organization has with using racial equity tools. So I'm gonna assume that you all can put your responses in here. Is it are racial equity tools currently embedded in your work? You're using them, you're very familiar with them, or no, this isn't an area of our organization's current work, but we're thinking about adding these into our suite of tools for our work. So just there's a range of options here, and we'll rely on my tech friends to let me know once folks have responded to the poll. All right, check it out. Okay, so we've got about a good majority of people with some degree of familiarity, which is great. And we also have some folks in the audience who are eager, it looks like. About a little more than a third of you are on the on-ramp to using racial equity tools. And some of you are still starting out. So I think this will be really useful, and we hope to provide some real life examples towards the end of our presentation that will hopefully accelerate your use of racial equity tools. All right, next slide, please. So you all come from different backgrounds in terms of organizational type, doing different kinds of work in community. And so we wanted to let you know or share with you what racial equity tools look like in the context of advancing racial equity in local government. So as Tiffany mentioned, in the RESJ Act, advancing racial equity and social justice means closing gaps in outcomes so that race no longer predicts one's success while also improving outcomes for all. So what you see here on this slide is recognition that racial equity tools are both a process and a product. And we often say that they're a process and a product to help reduce and close gaps or reduce and eliminate racial disparities and other inequities. So starting on the right to left, as a product, racial equity tools make applying a racial equity lens concrete. So a racial equity lens allows you to see and notice things that otherwise may be implicit in the work that you're doing. So this provides a structured approach for identifying, analyzing, and interpreting data about historical and current racial disparities and inequities. Using a structured approach brings attention to the systemic inequities that produce racial disparities, barriers to access, and otherwise inequitable outcomes for communities that identify as Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC, or low-income communities. In terms of process, and I think this is a really important part to emphasize, it's really around the how you do your work, and it makes the how of it all explicit and disrupts often deeply embedded assumptions and norms in how we work. In terms of process, it's a best practice to use racial equity tools early and often. They should be conducted, or the work of a racial equity tool should be conducted with a variety of perspectives and diverse stakeholders. And it serves to provide an intentional pause to allow you to see and notice different aspects of a proposed policy or funding decision that otherwise may not have been considered. And what we've learned, and we can kind of get to this later, is that all of these how issues, all of these how you do your work and use a racial equity tool really require an appetite and readiness for institutional change. So the how of decision making is often implicit in what we do, and we are using racial equity tools to disrupt some of that implicit assumptions, and in doing that, help to bring forth areas that we can address through policy. So the result of a racial equity tool, or what you get from a racial equity tool, is a systemic examination of likely impacts of government decisions on racial and ethnic groups or low-income communities. We use racial equity tools to minimize adverse consequences. We use them as a way to ensure that racial equity impacts are at the core of decision making, and they're a way to raise voices of traditionally marginalized or excluded communities. They're also a way to raise awareness of our racial equity and social justice issues in the community. So it brings attention, it both brings attention to issues that the community may not be aware of in such granular detail, and it also helps to shift the power dynamics so that others in the room who haven't traditionally had a voice have a way of having their voices heard. So next slide, go to the next slide. So as you might imagine, there are different kinds of racial equity tools to support different kinds of decision making. So in local government, these may be focused on budget or resource allocations or things like hiring or things like procurement. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these main functions. So for example, in addition to conducting racial equity impact assessments, our office, the Office of Racial Equity and Social Justice, also develops and uses budget equity tools to help analyze operating and capital budget proposals. But of course, the purpose of this discussion is around racial equity impact assessments and racial equity and social justice impact statements. So let's move on. I'm going to introduce my colleague, Jan Marie, from the Office of Legislative Oversight, and she and I will walk through the approaches we use in conducting the assessments from our offices. Jan Marie, over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. So again, I'm Jan Marie Pena with the Montgomery County Office of Legislative Oversight. And kind of like we shared earlier, we have a few different racial equity assessments that are happening for different kinds of county proposals. And so in my office, in OLO, we draft the racial equity and social justice impact statements for bills that are introduced to our county council. And this is a counterpart to the racial equity impact assessments, or REIAs, that are drafted for the supplemental appropriations, which Sarah and her team works on in the Office of Racial Equity and Social Justice. So the slide just has some key questions that we go through in the development of racial equity assessments. So we're going to go through each of these questions to explain each of our offices' approaches and the tools that we use to be able to develop our assessments. And generally, so our offices, we have kind of different approaches and tools at our disposal for the first and last question on this slide, but generally our approaches and our tools are the same for the middle three questions. And so Sarah and I are gonna kind of tag team this. We'll take the lead on a few of the slides and jump in, as we have different points to raise. So can I get the next slide, please? So the first question, what information accompanies the proposal being assessed? So this is an area where we actually differ a little bit. So Sarah, do you want to jump in and explain what you have available in your office?
Sure. So when we receive a supplemental appropriation for which we conduct a racial equity impact assessment, we receive some preliminary information about the proposal. And in addition to that, we also oftentimes receive a bit of information that the department has prepared about who is likely to benefit from the proposal, who might be burdened by the proposal and its impacts, and whether the proposal is likely to advance racial equity and social justice. And so that gives us a baseline from which to orient the remainder of our analysis.
Thank you. So in OLO, we're doing our racial equity assessments on bills or proposed changes to law. And so what we usually have is an introduction staff report for the bill that's being introduced to the council. And this staff report is always going to include the text of the proposed policy. Sometimes the report will also include a memo that it provides more explanation behind what the intent of the bill is, but really the level of detail that we have upon bill introduction, it varies. And oftentimes, even when we do have a lot of detail on what the bill is intended to do in general, there isn't a lot of explanation or analysis of what impacts are expected, particularly as it pertains to racial equity. Can I get the next slide, please? So the next question, how do you begin your analysis? So this is actually an area where our offices are pretty similar. And so the first step that we usually take is to review the context. So it's really important to understand the past and present of how racism exists within the given policy area that we're analyzing. And so for the historical context, we may already have some background and sources on this, from reading we've done. We kind of have a library of impact statements that we've produced at this point as well. So we're kind of building our knowledge base through there as well. But if we don't already have this background, it would usually just kind of involve an internet search to find sources of information. And so, for instance, if we're dealing with a policy that pertains to transportation, we might search something like transportation, history of racism in transportation, things of that nature. And what we find is that when we do searches like that, it'll usually present information in more of a national context, but it does sometimes point you to specific issues where you may be able to find more local information. So for instance, in the same, with the same example of transportation, there is a history of interstate highways being built through Black communities. And so in our impact statements, we've been able to elevate local examples of where this has happened in our own community. And so for the current context, it's really helpful to kind of, just review local news articles to kind of get a sense of what's happening in the area today. I would say kind of especially, in this age of misinformation, sources are really important. So sticking to trusted sources that are well cited, I would say that are more neutral as well is very important. And so this review of context, it's really helpful for identifying what are the structural factors that are driving racial disparities in the community. And it helps to spark thinking about how the proposed policy could possibly be affecting these structural factors that would maybe lead to more equitable processes or outcomes within this area. So next slide, please. So what kind of data do you analyze? So this is another area where our offices are similar. So to analyze the racial equity and social justice impact, we try to answer two questions. So first, we try to understand who are the primary beneficiaries of the proposed policy, and also what racial and social inequities could this policy strengthen or weaken. And so if we identify that the bill will have an impact on a specific group of constituents, so for example, older adults, renters, maybe constituents within a particular geography, we try to present the demographics of these groups by race and ethnicity and compare this to the demographics of the county as a whole to see if there is any over or underrepresentation of specific racial groups. If we see that the bill could have an impact on a specific outcome, so for instance, a specific health condition, housing affordability, things of this sort, we also try to present data on what are the existing racial disparities within the given outcome. One thing I want to note is that sometimes disaggregated data isn't always available. And so we do have to kind of find creative ways to approximate disparities. So for instance, we had a policy where we were analyzing changes to road design in the county. And so this is something where there is not, easily available clear data on how, on what racial disparities exist. And so what we did in this case is that we looked at the breakdown of spending on road design projects and analyzed if there were any differences geographically in where spending was happening and what the demographics of residents in those geographies were to see if these projects did appear to benefit one group of residents more than others. And I'll also say too that a lack of disaggregated data is really relevant as well. So when data isn't available by race and ethnicity, that there's often an opportunity there to elevate that and highlight that as a place where racial equity and social justice could be enhanced within a policy by creating, a process or a mechanism for more data to be collected. And then finally, of course, we will also consider, any eligibility, selection, and prioritization criteria involved with the proposal, involved with in terms of like who would receive the benefits of it, and see if we can identify, any differential impacts that could potentially happen by race and ethnicity. So I'll turn it to you, Sarah.
Great, Jean-Marie, thank you so much. So next slide. Okay, so what drives our conclusion, what drives our finding statement, kind of what drives our so what at the end of this analysis? This is an area where Jean-Marie and our work is very similar. So essentially, what we're trying to do is take what we've learned from our research and analysis, kind of covering all those points that Jean-Marie just mentioned, to determine how that proposal will affect a racial disparity or inequity that we've identified. So we'll look at whether the proposal will address the symptoms of a racial disparity and prevent a gap from widening. Say, for example, if we're dealing with an issue of food insecurity, the resources that are being allocated to or devoted to food distribution may help to prevent a gap in food security or food insecurity from widening, but it likely won't change the underlying factors that are creating food insecurity for members of our community. So sometimes we'll touch on the sort of more symptomatic aspects of a racial disparity. And in our findings, we'll look at whether what we found in our research will help to sort of shift some of the underlying structural aspects of a racial inequity. So for example, if we're thinking again about food insecurity, that would mean, disrupting the underlying causes and conditions related to income and wealth inequality. And so I think, that's something that we try to raise up in our findings, is whether the proposal will, what sort of level of impact the proposal will have. And then similarly, we look at the scale of the impact, or try to figure out to what extent the proposal will advance racial equity. Will it be of a great benefit, a minimal benefit, potentially harmful, very harmful? So to do this sort of scaling, or this measurement of scale, we consider the relative size of the proposal, and oftentimes also the complexity of the proposal, where it falls in the process of, say, a project. So is this really about setting the foundation of a new institute or a new center, a new development project, or is this really about the implementation or the maintenance of a particular facility or something to that effect? As referenced on the slide, excuse me, sometimes our finding is inconclusive. We hold ourselves to a very high standard in terms of the type of research and analysis we do. And so where we can't definitively say that something will advance racial equity or cause gaps to widen, where we can't make that determination, we indicate that. Oftentimes there's not enough detail about the proposal itself. And something that we find in our office is that oftentimes we don't really have a good sense of the origin of the proposal, right? So where did this request come from? Was this really driven by a community groundswell, grassroots, advocacy request? Or is this really about taking advantage of perhaps a funding opportunity? And so each of the origins around these proposals, we think, also plays into our assessment, particularly around the process piece. So was the process equitable leading to this proposal? Next slide, please. Great, awesome. So this is where OLO, Jean-Marie's office, and RESJ, my office, Tiffany and I's office, this is where our offices differ a little bit. So we're not required in the legislation to provide recommendations related to our proposals. When it's possible, we do share best practices, methods, and approaches used in other jurisdictions for the consideration and implementation of a proposal, or for the consideration in the future, looking out for future grant opportunities or future program design. We really want to highlight the kinds of work that is going to advance racial equity and social justice and help to reduce racial disparities. Jean-Marie, do you want to jump in about OLO's requirement?
Yeah, so OLO, per the RESJ Act, we are required to provide recommended amendments on bills that are anticipated to have a negative racial equity and social justice impact. So we do offer that for those bills. However, we do sometimes offer, items for consideration for bills that, may have more neutral or positive, are anticipated to have a more neutral or positive impact. If we do see, opportunities or things that could be implemented that would make it more equitable.
Great, and we'll actually share like a brief example of when a recommended amendment for a bill that Jean-Marie proposed was included in the final bill that was passed by our county council. And so there definitely are opportunities for racial equity and social justice impact statements and REIAs to sort of influence and shape the decisions that lawmakers are making. Next slide, please. Great, awesome. So we wanted to just take a second. We talked a little bit about data analysis. So Jean-Marie alluded to several of the sources that we use and kind of the approaches that we consider and how we interpret the data. And many of you will be familiar with some of these data sources. As you can see, we use a range of data sources, local data, and also national data to help us kind of see if there are trends or patterns that are taking place also at the local level. In addition to this list of data that is often available outside of the county and publicly, we also look at administrative data or programmatic output and outcome data when it's available. So in the case of supplemental appropriations, oftentimes it's about funding perhaps or continuing funding an existing initiative or continuing funding beyond a pilot. And so we would be asking for data to help us understand what the outcomes related to that funding have been already. And in particular, we look at the disaggregated sort of understanding of who is experiencing what in regards to a program or with regards to a program. It's so foundational for us to disaggregate data when possible. That is one of the best ways that we are able to identify whether a disparity or disproportionalities is happening around an aspect of public policy. As Jean-Marie mentioned, there are other ways that we can measure and assess whether a community is receiving equitable investment or experience related to local government. But for sure, in most instances, we are really looking at disaggregating data to understand people's community members' differentiated experiences. We also, it's maybe valuable to those in the audience, you might have had experience with this, but for example, in the Prosperity Now scorecard, which I know Shanice will mention towards the end of the presentation, you can disaggregate data at the local level, at the county level, and you can see how different community members and constituencies are experiencing the economy within your particular jurisdiction. So there's different economic indicators that you can look at by race and ethnicity, which can highlight areas of disparity for action or intervention. It's also really, really important to mention that we use qualitative research quite a bit to build our contextual understanding. I, for one, am not an expert in every policy area, so really lean on the scholarship of others to understand what some of the historical features are of a racial inequity or disparity that helps me to understand what's happening now and tie those pieces of information together. With additional time, and certainly a best practice, and I think I mentioned this earlier, to engage with community members, to engage with stakeholders who have lived experience in the issue being considered. And all of these things help us to build a more comprehensive understanding of how a proposal, a proposed action or proposal would help to advance racial equity and social justice. Okay, next slide. So this is the fun part. So we wanted to give you all a sense. We've been talking a lot about what the features are of a racial equity impact assessment, or a RESG, racial equity and social justice impact statement. And we wanted to kind of give you a sense for what these tools can be used, what these tools look like in practice. So we're going to share a recent example that involves economic development in the biohealth or life science sector in Montgomery County. And so many of you will be familiar with a range of economic development strategies that different jurisdictions pursue to build and strengthen their local economy. And what we're really focused on here are two proposals that we used REIAs and RESGs to help determine potential racial equity impacts. So the first proposal, and these are screenshots, you can go to the internet and find more details about these stories, but for the purposes of this conversation, the first proposal is related to startup and operational funds for the Institute for Health Computing. So in November 2022, so fairly recently, an MOU was signed establishing the Institute, so this Institute for Health Computing, which is a strategic partnership with University of Maryland, Baltimore, University of Maryland, College Park, and the University of Maryland Medical System, and of course, Montgomery County, and is envisioned to support the county's life science industry and employment base and boost economic development. So that was one proposal where we used a REIA, and we'll come back and kind of share a little bit about our analysis. The second proposal, and Jan Marie can share a little bit more about this, is related to the county's Small Business Innovation Research and Small Business Technology Transfer Matching Grant Program. So some of you may have heard of these SBIR and STTR grants. And this is part of the county's Economic Development Fund, and focuses on providing grants to county businesses that receive phase 1 and phase 2 of the SBIR and STTR, which are grants that business owners or researchers can use to conduct research in medicine, biotech, and life sciences. And these are like pretty important. If you're not familiar with sort of like the life science sector, these are oftentimes like the seed capital used to sort of kick off or accelerate a project or venture. So the proposal in the case of this bill was aimed at changing the requirements related to the grant program to allow for greater flexibility in the program's administration. And so Jan Marie will talk more about that when she gets to the RESG that she conducted. But both of these proposals, and the reason we highlighted them is because counties have a great deal of power in kind of determining whether economic development and the benefits of economic development are shared, are broadly shared, where prosperity is shared among all residents. And so in looking at these two proposals that strengthen the life sciences and biohealth sectors, we know that these things will likely have a positive sort of benefit to the county overall, but we really wanted to focus in on whether these proposals would help to reduce racial disparities and issues of employment and entrepreneurship in the life sciences and biohealth sector. So we can kind of get into that in a moment. Next slide, please. Great. So as I mentioned, what we recognized in our analysis right off the bat for this institute that I'm going to share more about was that there were going to be a series of short-term and long-term activities and benefits related to the investment. But since the funding that our proposal was focused on, related to, was focused on startup cost, we didn't analyze how the research component of the institute may affect health disparities or issues of health inequity in the future. So we really focused on education and employment and life science in the life sciences industry and the STEM fields more broadly. So what we looked at, kind of going back to how Jan Marie was running us through the beginning part of our analysis, we really looked at how the institute may affect employment and education, and also the small business ecosystem, particularly how it could be used to advance equitable access for business owners of color, women, and other excluded groups. So we looked at first we looked at employment trends in the life science field. We said, okay, we're focused on life science field. What's happening in that field in terms of employment? We focused specifically on the types of occupations that the Institute is likely to employ. And we looked at the wages from those top 3 occupations. And we found that all 3 of the wages for those top 3 occupations that were likely to be hired in the first phase of this institute exceeded the county's self-sufficiency standard. So these were likely to be jobs that provided enough money, enough income to meet the basic needs of an individual, of a family in the county. So these were going to be well-paying jobs. And so then we looked at who is likely to be employed in these higher wage jobs, who's going to be the beneficiary or the recipient of this opportunity based off of historical data. So we used national data from 2021, and we used some local data. And what we found was that there was an underrepresentation of Black and Latino workers in the top 3 occupations that were likely to be hired in the first phase of this institute. So at the county level, we also found something similar, which is that Black and Latino workers were less likely to be in management, business, science, and arts occupations than their white and Asian counterparts. So then we looked at, okay, we have this data. It's telling us that there's an underrepresentation, that there's a disparity here. And then we looked at why. Why does this exist? What are the underlying causes? So first, some of you might be familiar with some of this, but research shows that the lack of diversity in science, tech, and engineering and math, or STEM fields, of which life science is a subcategory, is persistent and structural. It is persistent and structural. So we clued in very quickly to what the root causes of that persistent and structural underrepresentation is related to. And so there was a lot of literature, a lot of things that we looked at about how, even dating back to the colonial era to the present, racial inequities have characterized many aspects of the healthcare system, and by extension, the biohealth industry. So that covers everything from the composition of the workforce, as well as the treatment and outcomes of BIPOC patients or people in the healthcare system. So there is systemic and structural factors shaping the experiences of BIPOC individuals in the biohealth industry. Okay, so then we also know that persistent occupational and educational segregation has put up barriers to participating or gaining access to opportunities to gain skills in STEM fields, gain skills and gain work experience in STEM fields. There's been an underinvestment in training and support for STEM teachers, and equitable access to higher education. And all these things together continue to limit the participation and advancement of Black and Latino and women workers in STEM fields. So for us, what we did, we took that together and we said, well, the employment inequities that we just highlighted here are really unlikely to narrow in the short term as they relate to this proposal. And then many of the systemic factors, and kind of alluding to the entrepreneurship piece a moment ago, many of the systemic factors that limit the participation of Black and Latino women workers in STEM fields as workers also affect the demographic composition of business owners in STEM fields, as well as the size and survival of those businesses. So we can kind of go into other details, but what really became clear to us in our analysis was the short-term startup costs related to this institute were likely going to afford employment opportunities to certain occupations with certain wages that were simply less accessible to Black and Latino workers, women workers, and that inaccessibility was structural and systemic. And so it was really important to raise that up in our analysis. And I am going to pass it to Jan Marie just to talk about the second proposal I mentioned a moment ago.
Thanks, Sarah. So the proposal that we analyzed was for a bill that was introduced in the fall of 2022. And effectively, kind of like Sarah explained, there's this federal grant program. It's the Small Business Innovation Research and Small Business Technology Transfer Program. Very long name. But effectively, our county has a program where we match the grants that businesses receive from this federal program. And it's a program that's created, it was created, to incentivize, and biotech businesses in the county. And so this was an existing program, and what the bill was aiming to do was to change the structure of the program, effectively in the law, the eligibility requirements, the maximum grant amounts, that was all written into law for the existing program. And so what this bill was aiming to do was to take some of those pieces out and actually move it into the executive branch so that they could determine some of those requirements through regulation. And so a colleague had actually previously written an impact statement around the biotech industry earlier in the year for a zoning text amendment. And so I leaned on that a lot for developing the racial equity and social justice impact statement for the bill, and referenced it as well, just as a an additional source of information for people to find related to this bill, and also to kind of also understand that kind of like the timeline of these different policies as it relates to biotech. And so within the impact statement, we provided a history of racism as a context for existing racial disparities in the biotech industry. So kind of like Sarah explained in more detail, it was really important to put in context why exactly these racial disparities are occurring in the field. And with that, we provided data disaggregated by race to demonstrate what racial disparities existed among business owners and employees in STEM and in biotech. And like Sarah explained, what we found was that white and Asian people were overrepresented among business owners and employees in STEM and biotech. The best data that we had available to kind of support this, as far as business ownership, it was at the metro level. And for employment generally in STEM and biotech, it was at the national level. So usually we try to find, the most local data as possible to kind of present as supporting, information. But in these cases, we had to lean kind of on these larger geographies to make the case. But it kind of also emphasizes too just the benefit of having our different offices doing this type of analysis as well. And we are able to kind of look at what different approaches our colleagues are taking and different sources they're leaning on to be able to demonstrate these disparities as well. And so for the ultimate analysis, ideally, in order to understand who would truly benefit from these changes, it would have been ideal to have data from the existing program on, the awardees who had already received the grant, and to have that data, disaggregated by race and ethnicity, but that was not something that the program was collected. And so we instead reference the data that we were able to find on representation in STEM and biotech and business owners and employees to kind of demonstrate that white and Asian people are overrepresented in these fields, and that they were already the likely beneficiaries of this existing program. And so what we ultimately concluded, or our final kind of result, was that the bill would likely have a minimal impact on racial equity and social justice. So we noted that the program in and of itself, as it existed, was likely reinforcing disparities in STEM and biotech, because it was most likely that these grants were already mostly going to white and Asian business owners, and already, just reinforcing the racial disparities that exist in the field as a whole. But what we ultimately concluded was that the changes that they were proposing to make through this bill to the program in and of itself was likely not going to change that. So it's a program that's already inequitable, and the changes that, the bill is proposing to make is just gonna, keep more than likely continue to reinforce those inequities. And so in this case, even though we did anticipate that the bill would have a neutral impact, we did offer an item for council consideration to kind of enhance racial equity and social justice more in the policy proposal. And what we suggested is that the council require that the program start collecting data on race and ethnicity of the applicants and also of the people who are ultimately awarded the grant, so that there was more information on how, on if there are racial disparities that exist in this program. And that is actually one consideration that the council ultimately did implement into the final bill. Get the next slide, please. And I think I'm going to hand it to Tiffany.
Thank you, Jean Marie. Thank you, Sarah. It was a great presentation, a lot of information for the audience to digest. But I hope you guys take some time, and if you need to, take a look at this presentation again, just a little bit on next steps. We have been doing this work probably just over 2 years, producing both racial equity impact assessments and racial equity and social justice impact statements. And we are constantly trying to improve both our process, trying to improve how we lift up our advice to our decision makers, and lastly, always trying to figure out the kind of impact we're having on decision making within our county, right? So both decision making that on our bills and legislation, as well as how people are using our REIAs and resource allocations. And then also trying to lift this up for community members. This work can be fairly bureaucratic. A lot of what goes on is very internal. We pass memos and send statements out, mostly to council and to our executive and departments, but wanting to engage our community members in what we are advising around racial equity and social justice, and how really to embed racial equity in all of our decision makings. And we will continue to try to get better at doing that. We will continue to work on on deciding or really seeing the kind of impact we are having in our space. We've been doing this, like I said, for a good 2.5 years, and I think doing it really well. As you can see, both Sarah and Jean Marie are incredibly thoughtful and really smart about going about how we look at our decisions and our issue areas with a racial equity lens, and lifting up, of course, historical context. So it's a little bit about how we see our path forward in the coming years. We will continue to get better, and hopefully folks will give us feedback so that we can be even more useful to our jurisdiction. I think I am sending this off now to Shanice for our question and answer session.
Yes, so thank you, Tiffany, Jean Marie, and Sarah for such a wonderful presentation. So we're going to go ahead and get into our Q&As. Next slide, please. And as we're doing our Q&As, feel free to drop a question in the question box. All right, so the first question that we have is, what opposition, is a two-parter, what opposition have you received to this process? And is there any advice you can give to those who want to implement REIs or RESJs?
Yeah, I'll take that one. I think we'll start, like when we first started doing this, I feel like many folks just didn't know how to receive it, right? So we do REIAs for supplemental and resource decisions, and required to do so. So a lot of departments, after we would do our analysis, would come back to us and be fearful that they were not going to get the funding that they needed to do whatever process that they needed. And so we did a lot of kind of reassuring around our intent, quite frankly. We know that we're at the beginning of this process and that people have not necessarily looked at their supplemental appropriation through the lens of racial equity. Our intent really is to help people think about this and to grow in the process of creating a racial equity lens. So we are not intending to punish, right? Punish people for not thinking about this. We do not intend to necessarily keep money from flowing into programs that people need to put forward. But we do intend for them to see that while you think that this program is helping all people, that in fact it may not. And so we want you to take that information and to design, once you get this money, because the money comes before the program, right? We want you to take this money and then to actually think thoughtfully and seriously about how you can actually use this money to in fact make sure that everybody, people of color included, are getting what they need out of this program, this process, whatever you need the resource for. So I think that was the first half. What was the second half of the question, Shanice?
So the second question is there any advice you can give to those who want to implement these assessments?
I would just say, I think Sarah pointed to this earlier, like it's really important that you have an organization that wants to do the work, that understands that a growth mindset is needed. Like we can't be fixed in this. This is innovative work. This is work that challenges the way that people currently think, currently do their processes, that challenges and makes people pause. Anytime we would often get pushback on how long it takes. You would be so surprised at how much people would be like, well, can you get it to us tomorrow? No, we can't. But it is an intentional pause. And, pace absolutely matters. And that it's important to think and continue to think about how we are doing this. If you're going to go at the same pace, oftentimes you're probably going to be doing the same thing you've already been doing, even though you've said you want to do something different. So one, take your time. Two, make sure that you have an organization that actually is wed to doing it. And three, create a growth mindset. Like it's okay not to know, but it's not okay to not continue to know. Like we've got to continue to educate ourselves and to build on the things that are already in place.
All right, thank you. And so the next question is, are more counties in Maryland planning to implement these assessments?
I will say I am not sure if more counties in Maryland are thinking about doing it. I know that there are counties in Virginia that are thinking about it and that are doing it. They're doing it kind of differently than we are doing it. But I can say that I think this type of work is spreading in the government sphere. Well, I'll have a meeting with some of my other colleagues around the state later this month or early in March, and so I'll poll them to see how many folks are intending to use REIAs and racial equity, social justice impact statements.
Awesome. So the next question, so there was actually two questions, particularly about social media. So to what extent do you use social media in your work? And can you talk a little bit about the process of getting community feedback? What techniques did you use? So it's a two-part question.
Is this all me again? So we don't use social media, actually. One of our next hires will be a comms person. And so that is part of our plan to use social media. And if I'm frank with you, the same goes for community engagement in this process. We have not figured out how to do that on either side. So that's both in OLO and in the Office of Racial Equity and Social Justice. We have been thinking about this from the very beginning, though, like how can we insert the community voice in the tight timeline that we have to turn these around? I think it's 14 days for OLO, is that right, Jean-Marie? 21 days for us. It's
21 days for us as well.
20 days for us, 14 days. Yeah, so it's really tight. And oftentimes we don't know what issues are gonna come, right? So we get all of our supplemental appropriations come from our Office of Management and Budget. And it could be anything from storm runoff to like affordable housing. And so we're like, okay, well, what's the community engagement or what's the community we need to engage in to talk about storm runoff? Are they ready to hear about this? Do they know about this? Do we need to do a good amount of prepping and priming of the community to even get them to know and understand how this functions within the county? And so I will say that that is still an area of growth, of needed growth for both of our offices.
All right, and so then the next question is a great question. So do you all have a template for assessments that can be used or adapted by other organizations?
I'll leave that for Sarah or Jean Marie.
Yeah, the links that Shanice put in the chat a few minutes ago were essentially like the library of racial equity and social justice impact statements and racial equity impact assessments from both of our offices. And so those are the full list of assessments that we have conducted. And so you can kind of see what that looks like across a range of issue areas. We also put in the chat, or we're about to put in the chat, a link to OLO's racial equity and social justice legislative review tool that has a collection of, I mean, Jean Marie, you can touch on this, but that has a collection of questions and prompts that are really useful in beginning to do a racial equity impact assessment.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And yes, the link is in the chat. So the next question is, what advice/wisdom do you have for folks wanting to explore creating a racial equity and justice initiative like Montgomery County's?
I would say till the soil, right? And this is something, and when I say that, I mean, work on the culture where you are going to plant this work. Like the readiness part before you start the work is even more important than the work itself. Do a good amount of training, do a good amount of reading, make sure that folks understand that it is not going to be business as usual. Like, in fact, you're asking for not business as usual. And the more you do that, the more successful the actual work will be, right? So understand the culture that you're working in, and 2, assess whether or not folks are ready for growth. And 3, start to put in some of the groundwork before you start to do some of the technical things like REIAs, like operating budget equity tools. We're just finishing up our operating budget. So the budget equity tools. So because, you'll get opposition simply because people are not used to it. You'll get opposition because people have not challenged the way that things work, not just for racial equity, but in general.
All right, so your response has generated 2 more questions.
Oh, gracious.
Really great questions. So you did speak about getting the ball moving in your in your backyard, your jurisdiction. So is there any specific advice you could give the audience about getting movement towards changes after people are educated on these topics?
I don't know if is there specific advice I can give about specific movement or specific what, Shanice?
Yes, I'll read it again. So what advice give to get movement towards changes after we are educated on these topics? So I guess how to get the ball moving.
That's a great question. You two feel free to jump in. I think one of the biggest things is make sure that your leadership is on board and really on board. Make sure that they are willing to use the resources that are necessary to make sure that this is sustained. Right, a lot of what has been going on, I think, around the country in this region in particular, is that we have a lot of chief equity officers, and many offices are not as big as Montgomery County's. Ours started off actually pretty tiny, So you have to give people the resources necessary to do the work. And then, what did I say? I'd say lastly, get in community, right? Get in community with other organizations like yours that are doing the work, organizations that are not like yours that are doing this work. Look, read, ask questions, and stay in community, because it really is where you get energy, right? There's a particular power in not having to kind of explain yourself or explain the importance of this, and sometimes like that can be empowering for us, and it can also be validating. So I would say lastly, yeah, stay in community and stay with people who believe in this as well.
So to follow up on that, so for instance, of course. So follow up on that. So for instance, if you don't like the willingness isn't there top down. So you're going to many summits and you're going to many events, and the large part or the large agreement is that we should do these things, but the buy-in really isn't there from top down. So is there any could people pull in community?
Absolutely. You should absolutely leverage community. So we, part of creating this act, we actually leveraged a good amount of community stakeholders that were key in creating the bill, creating what was in the bill. We have a racial equity and social justice advisory committee. We have got a lot of feedback from community members, and that particular committee is actually paid, and that particular amendment to the bill came from a group of nonprofits that were very interested in making sure that this work is solidified in the county. So you should absolutely leverage community, particularly in a political sphere, because in fact, they are who your elected officials are accountable to. And so while those folks may not be in agreement or championing this work at first, when their constituents start to ask for it over and over and over again, they will eventually get on board. So I think that leveraging community, no matter where you are in the space, thank you for lifting that up, is essential.
Thank you so much. And so the last question that we have is, has there been any work to include racial equity statements within administrative rules?
I don't know if I understand that question. Administrative rules? I don't know if I understand that. Like, I'd have to get an example.
Okay. If the person could that put that in, if you could follow up, that would be great.
And Shanice,
right.
if it's possible to drop in the chat, there's a report that our colleague Dr. Elaine Bonner-Tompkins and others in the Office of Legislative Oversight put together about racial equity in government decision-making, lessons from the field. And it gets to the point or the question somebody was asking about moving forward or momentum. And there's many different starting points, and something that I've learned from reading this work and being in community, reading this report and being in community, is that there really is no one approach or template or thing that's going to seed this work or accelerate it once it's started. So I think the report helps to highlight different examples from other jurisdictions and the kind of tilling of the soil that Tiffany was talking about, and how long that really took in a lot of other places, and the kinds of investment that was required to get it going. And just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
All right. So I don't think we have any more questions for today. So then we can go to the next slide. All right, next steps. So there's many ways to get in touch with us or keep in touch with us, including visiting our advocacy centers and signing up for one of our many networks. And also, please look out for our Prosperity Now Encore webinar. So this is the very first kickoff for the Encore series. So please stay tuned. We'll have some things throughout the course of the year. And don't forget to complete the follow-up survey. Our network building team will be very, very happy for the feedback. Next slide, please. All right, so in case you're wondering, here are some of our networks: our Financial Security Network, Affordable Housing Network, Taxpayer Opportunity Network, and our Campaign for Every Kid's Future. And so just follow with us if you want to get plugged into those. And lastly, we have a sweet Valentine's Day treat for you this year. So on Tuesday, February 14th, we're going to be releasing our 2023 scorecard. And if you're not familiar with our scorecard, it is a financial stability database with financial health outcomes such as poverty rate and low financial well-being, and policies we assess, like, does the state remove asset limits on social safety net programs, or if the state has an adequate baby bonds program. So stay tuned. And next slide, please. All right, so this is the final slide. So thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.